Well, Tuesdays are a nice day because Em takes the kids to school on Tuesdays. So essentially I got an extra half hour to work on projects around the homestead. It's pouring today, which is nice because it's the first rain we've had in a while. Very unusual for fall in Maine. So I'm going to do an inside project that I've been putting off for a long time. Today's project will be to rebuild our interior firewood storage area, which sits right next to the wood stove in the basement. The previous owner had a wood boiler in the basement where we now have our wood stove. He constructed this area to hold his firewood. Unfortunately, he constructed it in the wrong orientation. In order to get firewood into the storage bunk, we need to bring it all the way around this wall, then back into the bunk. On the list of projects around our homestead when we first moved in, fixing this problem was near the bottom. I figured I would just live with it and fix it eventually. Well, we've been through 3 winters with this setup, and I've hated it more each year. For the past 2 winters, I was working in a distant part of the state with 2 hours round-trip commute every day. I would start the wood stove in the morning, then start it again when I got home. Now that I'm working from home, however, I anticipate burning more wood and trying to keep the furnace from kicking on during the day. My home office is in the basement not far from the wood stove, and since I'm going to be using this a lot more, the time has come to rebuild this problem. However, there are a couple of difficulties which are probably the reason the previous owner oriented this in the direction he did. First, there's a copper heat pipe running along the back wall on the ceiling. The interior septic tank access pipe, which all houses in Maine are required to have now, is in the way on the floor. So this project will involve some thoughtful design. All told, this project probably took me about 2 hours, an hour and a half before work, and a half hour during lunch. I have 2 thoughts about that. First, if it only took me 2 hours, I definitely should have done it a long time ago. Second, through reviewing and editing all the footage for this video, a good amount of that 2 hours was actually spent thinking things through before making cuts. This is good practice, but it's taken me several years to get to the point where I spend what I think is an appropriate amount of time thinking things through before jumping into a project. It definitely pays off in material saved and frustration avoided. Here is a good example of the thinking things through that I was mentioning. My first thought was that I was going to cut the top and bottom of the bunk wall to the same length. But, as I went to cut the top, it occurred to me that that wouldn't work because of the copper pipe I mentioned earlier. So, I changed the plan. Though, as you'll see in a moment, I wasn't able to change it enough to compensate and avoid the pipe. Alright, it's 9 o'clock, so I need to get to work. I'm not finished this project, but that's what Nights and Weekends Homestead is all about. So I'll just come back to this when I have some more time tonight, or maybe when I take a lunch break. We'll see. But I did run into a problem that I knew I was going to run into. I was hoping I had solved it with an easy fix, but I didn't. I want my uprights to be halfway between where my firewood is going to be. So if I have a 16-inch piece of firewood, I want this to be at 8 inches of that, and then the second row, I want this to be at 8 inches of that second row, so that I'm using this as my outer boundary holding up the firewood. So the issue is I've got this on the bottom exactly where it needs to be, but this copper heat pipe right here is the problem. So I need this to be about the outside edge of this. It needs to be about 7 1/8 from this 2x4, and right now it's about 10. What I was hoping was if I just cut this right here flush with this, that would be sufficient, but because I had to cut this a little shorter than would have made that perfect, it didn't work. So what I'm going to do is separate this, cut this back here, and then put in a little scab on both sides to make sure I can attach this to the wall up here and then it doesn't hit the copper. But we'll tackle that a little bit later today. When you need to put a screw into the end of a board, be sure you do so at an angle. You're essentially placing a screw in between the grain of the wood if you go head on, which means there is significantly reduced holding power. If you put the screw in at an angle, you're overcoming that by going through the grain at least a little. One of the final steps with this project was to square up the bottom of the bunk. Unfortunately, this does absolutely nothing in terms of strength. The problem is that this corner can easily push out this way. In the old setup, there was nothing preventing this at all, which is why I put these planks in. The only thing that's going to keep that from happening is the weight of all the firewood resting on this 2x4. I'm leaving it like this for now because I want to test this for a winter and make sure I like the setup. If I do, the next spring, when all the firewood is gone from this storage bunk, I'll come in and ram set this 2x4 to the floor, which will prevent it from sliding out. The last step was to replace and put up additional screws along the bunk wall that act as hangers to dry winter clothes. I spend a lot of time outside in the winter, and there's nothing like a wood stove to dry out snow-covered coats, snow pants, hats, and mittens.